Well, good morning, church. It is good to see all of you here this morning. I know we have a handful of visitors today, and if that's you, we are grateful to have you. You're an honored guest, and we hope that you come to know the love of God a little better by being here today. I'm a little more paranoid today. On Wednesday night when we hosted the Living Hope Refugee Church, I went up and spoke and did my thing, and then stuff was messed up, and I was told that I mutilate the microphone every time I go up to speak. Yeah, and I didn't know that. I thought, I like this. This is my style. And so I'm a little bit more paranoid now. You know, if you've not gotten a chance to join us for one of our Wednesday night branch out services, I really encourage you to come and see what it's all about. We've been doing it for some time now, but I know it's also fairly new. If it helps reduce your anxiety a little bit, we've set up this calendar on this wall on your way out if you go through these doors, and you can look and see every Wednesday night what is going to be happening, what our gathering of Christians is going to be doing. Like last week, we had a fellowship meal and got to hear the report of our partnership with the immigrant children, getting to learn more about our country. And next week, we're going to be doing a cleanup with one of our neighbors. There's some subsidized housing right down the road from us. And so we're going to go and take an hour from 7 to 8, be there and pick up some of the litter and some of the trash around these complexes to let them know that, hey, we are here and we care about you and we want to give you this small act of kindness. So, yeah, it's a great way for us to help live out our faith beyond these four walls, and I would encourage you to come and join us to do that this Wednesday and the things to come. So last week, we, in honor of our kids heading to church camp, we talked about what it is to head into the wilderness. Not just physical, but spiritual as well. You know, when we go into seasons of hardship in the wilderness, and the question we asked last week was, how do we feel about God in those spiritual wildernesses? What do we think about God? What is God at work doing, and how are we to be changed? And the point that I hope you walked away with last week was that through the wilderness, when our faith is tested, we should come out of the wilderness stronger than ever, stronger to face whatever might be before us, because we have seen how God cares for us with his presence, provision, and power, even in our worst moments. And now this week, our kids are back from camp. If you haven't gotten a chance to talk to any of them, I hope you do. They had a great experience, and I actually got the opportunity to be with them most of the day on Thursday, and I saw firsthand how God was really forming them and transforming them through their time of praise and worship and focus. You know, and now their wilderness was not so much of a valley like we talked about last week as much as it was a peak. It was a positive experience for them. They were in the literal wilderness, but it was good and they enjoyed it. But they come back changed, stronger than ever, like we hoped we would through our hard times as well. And so that's what I want to talk about today. You know, last week was about going into and through the wilderness, and this week we're going to be talking about coming out of the wilderness, what it looks like to get through the other side. You know, by being faithful in the wilderness, we have a clearer vision of God. We feel closer to him. We are changed for the better, and we come out ready to live the strong and faithful life. That's our plan for coming out of the wilderness. That's what we hope happens, that we are changed and more strong and more faithful. But oftentimes, without the pressures of the wilderness, without the solitude, the scarcity, or the struggle of the wilderness, it's easy to let that unique and special standing slip away, isn't it? Sometimes it takes those crucibles to make us feel closer to God, and then when we're out of the crucible, we start to slowly let go of it and fall into spiritual apathy. You know? I had the opportunity to do the campfire devo for the teens on Thursday night at their church camp. And I even told them there in the moment, I said, you know, I know that as we end the end of this week that your spiritual flame, the fire inside of you for God, that it is raging at an all-time high right now. I know that. I've been there. For 20-something years, I went to church camp, and it was that exact same experience. But time and time again, though you may feel unstoppable in those moments, time and time again, we get back into the everyday life. We come out of that mountaintop experience or that wilderness of struggle. We get into our daily rhythms, and those flames, they start to dim and they start to fade, don't they? You know, I know that it happened to me plenty of times in my life and still sometimes does. That my faith was on fire either because God rescued me from the wilderness or because of the blessings I saw from him while I was on the mountaintop. But eventually that passion, it slowly dulls over time. And I know that's a universal experience. I hope that you can maybe even pinpoint a moment in your life where you had told yourself, man, I'm a new person. I'm a stronger Christian. I'm not going to do the things I used to do. I'm going to be changed for the better. Maybe it was even after you came out of these waters of baptism, or maybe it was after a gospel meeting or a camp or something like that. But the question I want to ask about coming out of the wilderness is, how do we maintain our newfound strength after the wilderness? How do we keep ourselves from fading into that spiritual apathy after we've experienced God's gift of renewal? And for those of you who weren't here last week, we took the time to look at two examples of wilderness journeys in the Bible. We looked at Exodus, coming out of the Red Sea and entering into the wilderness before Mount Sinai, and how God was kind of testing them there and increasing their strength and their faithfulness. We also looked at Jesus, coming out of the waters of baptism and being thrust into the wilderness to be tested. And today I want us to jump back in on those stories, to finish them out a little bit, to see what they are fully saying on the other side of their wilderness. And that's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to follow back up. We saw Israel be tested and grow stronger. We saw Jesus be tempted and proved faithful. What happened after that? What happened in Exodus 19 and on? What happened in Matthew 5 and on? And that's what we're going to be doing. And so first off is Israel. Israel was led out of that wilderness to Mount Sinai, where they encountered God himself, who just enveloped the mountain in a cloud. And much of the dialogue that God had there on the mountaintop was shared specifically with Moses. But when God first arrived at Mount Sinai, before the entire assembly of Israel, these freshly rescued slaves out of Egypt, he doesn't just speak to Moses. He speaks to all of Israel, all who are gathered there at the foot of the mountain. They hear God's voice. And you know what he says? Here's a little bit of a summary, some selected verses over the next chapter. He says, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, and you shall not covet from your neighbor or anyone else." What is that? It's the Ten Commandments, yeah. They come out of slavery, rescued as the new people of God. They are thrust into the wilderness where they are deeply tested and tried. Their faith in God, it starts to grow stronger as they're forced to lean on him for their provision and their protection. And then on the other side, as they've kind of built themselves up into a little bit of spiritual strength and newness, God says to them, "You shall not, you shall, you shall not, you shall." The Ten Commandments. That's probably not the answer you expected to our question about how we maintain passion, was it? If I said, "Hey, how do we keep ourselves on fire for God?" and you brought me the Ten Commandments, I'd probably be like, "Well, I don't know. As much as we respect and admire the Ten Commandments, they don't exactly inspire, maybe, if we're being honest with ourselves. They don't exactly fan the flames of our spiritual excitement. Maybe they do for you, but I think, doing ministry for a handful of years, I don't think everyone feels that way about Old Testament law, And yet, this truly is the way to full and abundant life, isn't it? It's been maintained throughout the Bible. It's been maintained for 2,000 years that this is the way to full and abundant life. It's a way to consistently sturdy the flame inside of us. In the wilderness, God calls us to obey and be faithful, and we're rewarded for obedience and faithfulness in the wilderness. And now, back in our normal day-to-day life, God is still calling us to obey. He's still calling us to obey just like he did in the wilderness if we want to maintain that strength. Do you hear that? It was the obedience in the wilderness that helped us grow stronger, that helped that fire grow. And now in the normal day-to-day life, God is still saying the exact same thing. Obey me. Follow me. Do you remember this from chapter 15? I won't try to quote it exactly because I can't. But it said, "Obey me, follow me, and I will be your healer." Chapter 15 of Exodus. It's the same thing in the normal day-to-day life. It's not just the wildernesses or anything else. And, it might feel like, okay, obeying law. That doesn't feel like anything spectacular. That's not that, hidden secret we're wanting to answer all of our questions. But maybe it's the same faithfulness that is shown in the wilderness that is required in the boring parts of our lives. If we don't want to fade in our spirituality, if we don't want to lower our relationship with God, maybe it's nothing different than in the hard times of our lives. It's the exact same thing. And you might say, yeah, Houston, I get it. We have to be faithful. We have to be faithful to be strong and passionate in our faith. But surely there's more. Obeying commandments, that's just too dull for my flame. That's just not going to really get me there. It's not going to excite me. It's not going to inspire me. Well, I understand that. But let me just quickly point out that was not the case for some of these Old Testament heroes that we revere. It's not the case for people who did love God with a fiery passion like David. Psalm 119 is traditionally attributed to David. This is just one small selection from it. He writes, "Your statutes are wonderful, therefore I obey them. The unfolding of your words give light. It gives understanding to the simple. I open my mouth to pant, longing for your commands. Turn to me and have mercy on me as you always do to those who love your name. Direct my footsteps according to your word. Let no sin rule over me. Redeem me from human oppression, that I may obey your precepts. May your face shine on your servant and teach me your decrees. Streams of tears flow from my eyes, for your law is not obeyed." You see the passion there? You see just the heartfelt emotion about what it means to follow God's law? How many of us can stand here and say, like it said in verse 131, that you open your mouth and pant for commands of God? That's not really how we see things or act towards things. And listen to this, David only had the Old Testament law of Moses. That's what he's writing about here. He's not writing about the Sermon on the Mount or Romans. No, he's writing about Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Exodus. And it goes on. Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in the Bible. How many verses do you think that is? 176. 176 verses. I didn't double check, but there's no chapter longer than that, okay? That is the longest chapter in the Bible, and it is all about this. It's all about how wonderful and beautiful the law is. Verse 97, "Oh, how I love your law. I meditate on it all day long." Verse 103, "How sweet are your words to taste, sweeter than honey in my mouth." Verse 20, "My soul is consumed with longing for your laws at all time." Verse 127, "I love your commandments more than gold." And there's also one that says that the law is his theme song. I really liked that. That's my summary. But it says the law is my theme song in his own way. But that is exactly what he's saying. Excuse me. Clearly, David and other faithful people of God all those years ago had an appreciation for God's commandments that we just don't seem to have today. If we're honest, right? We don't write like this. We don't even think like this about God's laws and his commandments. And why is that? I can't help but think that maybe these ancient followers of God, that they had a deeper understanding of what day-to-day faithfulness could really do for their spirit. I think they had a deeper understanding of what day-to-day faithfulness, obedience to the law, following God, could do for their flame, right? The spirit inside of them. Us, on the other hand, what do? And not to step on your toes, we're always looking for the big things, aren't we? We're always chasing the big stuff. Church camp, Winterfest for our kids, gospel meetings, that one dynamic sermon that you might get once or twice a year, okay? We're looking for the big stuff. We want that big exclamatory thing to fan the flame inside of us and lift us up. But maybe we become blind to the fact that joy comes, true, genuine joy, true, genuine excitement and faith comes from day to day walking in the will and the ways of God, right? We forget that sometimes. And maybe you're still not convinced. Okay, well, Old Testament, sure. What about Jesus? He's usually a little fresher than the Old Testament. If we get, the 10 Commandments and literally like 15 more chapters of law in Exodus, what happens when Jesus came out of the wilderness? What did he do instead? Well, and like I mentioned last week, that little tidbit that Matthew and Exodus kind of follow each other, that Jesus really reflects the Israelite story. He's the same way. He comes out of that wilderness, and he goes to a new mountain and offers a new law to God's people. He delivers instructions to his disciples on how to live faithfully, just like Israel had received all those years ago. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. I won't read 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount this morning, but to briefly go through them, he starts off by telling them not to lose their saltiness. Okay? Don't lose your saltiness. Salt that has lost its saltiness is no good. And if I can mix my metaphors here, that's exactly what we're talking about this morning, right? Not losing our flame. What's an ember with no flame? What's salt with no saltiness? Don't lose what makes you worthwhile in your faith. And then the next thing he says, I'm not going to abolish the law. The very thing that we just started talking about. Jesus comes up and says, I'm not here to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And then he goes around and he starts expanding and depthening these different laws from the Old Testament. He says, as we just read, now you've heard it said don't murder, but now I'm telling you, don't even hate. Right? You know this. He says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, Old Testament law, 10 Commandments. But now I'm here to tell you, don't even lust. And these explanations, because I don't want to say alterations, I don't think that's right, but these explanations of the Old Testament law by Jesus, they drive the point home. That this is about letting not just your actions, but all of your thoughts be for godliness. Let your actions be for godliness? Sure, you got that in the Old Testament. But let your thoughts and let your everything be for godliness. In the way that the Old Testament law led Israel towards living in God's ways, Jesus now gives them a new covenant, showing the church a much fuller way that they can have that faithfulness. And it's not just head stuff like, don't lust, don't hate. That's all things that happen internally. He gives them external stuff as well. He talks to them about how to fast, how to pray, how to love their enemies, how not to judge as well. It's this all-encompassing, holistic way of living where everything from your head to your hands is to be done for God and for godly living. Now, let's put these 2 stories together, okay? The instructions given to Israel after the wilderness and the instructions given by Jesus after his wilderness. And what do we see? What do these 2 stories show us? What's the path that they're putting us on? What are we supposed to walk away with here? I know I'm asking for some critical thinking before 11. I know. If we take these, what am I getting at? What is the Bible getting at here? It's a call to live a discipled life, a disciplined life. If you've come out of the wilderness with new strength, if you've come out of the mountaintop with new passion, and you're afraid that that intensity will start to fade, the very best thing you can do to keep yourself on fire, to keep yourself healthy in your faith, is to live a disciplined, discipled life before God. That's what it is. To obey his laws, to live out of God's heart and commit every thought, every action to his greater purposes for this world. That's what it takes. We don't need to go chasing the highs, We shouldn't need regular struggles in the wilderness to get us to reconnect with God. If our faith is just waiting for the next church camp, is just waiting for the next dynamic sermon, something, or the next wilderness, like maybe I'm just apathetic about my faith until I hit a struggle and then that reconnects me with God. And it will. But if that's what our faith is, that's not right. We shouldn't need the highs or the lows to reconnect us. It's the faithfulness in the mundane, everyday life that will keep us strong. Not letting Satan tempt us from departing from God. Not letting Satan distract us from what needs to be done in our faith. And man, that's the big one, isn't it? Distraction. Man, Satan uses distraction. I'm almost convinced that Satan uses distraction more than temptation. these days. You know, spiritual flames are less put out by someone pouring water on it, like excessive sinning or simply stopping your faith in God altogether. I think a majority of the time they're put out by simple neglect. They're put out by simple neglect, not putting logs on the fire. We get so distracted by the worries of life that we forget to do that, to treat the fire, to feed the fire. We don't pray, we don't read our Bibles, we don't make it to the gathering of the church family. And the next thing you know, your fire is dimmed and it's just flickering and barely surviving. And for some people, it just goes out cold and the embers go cold. And we sit there and we wonder why. Oh, why don't I feel strong in my faith? Why don't I feel close to God? Do you want a strong faith? Do you want a raging fire? Then you have to live in discipleship. It sounds so simple. It sounds so easy. I mean, like, surely that can't just be the answer. But it is. There is no shortcut to this, guys. There's no shortcut around discipleship to a thriving, and I mean thriving, faith. Do y'all remember our series on spiritual disciplines from the first half of 2021? It's been a while now. I'll remind you. It's still on YouTube. But our series on spiritual disciplines in the first half of 21, things like prayer and Bible reading, fasting, silence and solitude, all of that. You know, we titled that series Sacred Rhythms because the point of these spiritual disciplines was to create a pattern of things that would continually draw us back to God, things that would continually reorient our focus on God and God alone, in His life and His love and His peace. And the very last sermon in that series, if you'll remember, was about creating a rule of life. A rule of life. If you don't remember, the rule of life is simply a list that we commit ourselves to of spiritual disciplines that we'll do on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, maybe an annual basis. We actually steal this from like the monks in 300 AD. After Rome took over the church and we had some problems, the monks slid out and they started doing this to maintain the fire within them. They just kept a list and they committed themselves to it. And so I'm sitting here as I'm writing this lesson, I'm thinking, man, if there's anyone here today who is struggling with this topic, who is hearing about a faith that fades after the valleys or after the peaks, let me encourage you to go back at that list that you made over a year ago. See what it is that you committed yourself to or wanted to commit yourself to. And maybe stop and think, how faithfully am I living out the things that I said I would? And let me encourage you to reclaim that. Now, you can adjust it, okay? Those rules of life are supposed to fit your season of life. And so if you got a lot more going on now than you did in 2021, then, rewrite it. Maybe cut out some things that you know aren't going to make it. Maybe add some things that you think would bless you. But go back to it and find, and I'm just a logistical mind here, right? Find a pattern, find a way, find a dedicated path that will keep you faithful in the day in and the day out. It's all about a closeness to God. To kind of illustrate that as we close up here, Delaney and I were in this nice building. We went to Chicago last month, and we were going into this building that had 2 escalators. And I noticed they were both going up, and so Delaney was going towards one, and me being childish, I decided to get on the other, all right? And we were holding hands, and we get on these 2 escalators, and I didn't look up high enough. If I did, I would have still done it, to see that they didn't just go up together, they branched out and they diverged along the path. And so we're holding hands and it gets a little further, starts pulling your elbow out of socket. She's trying to let go, I won't let her. And you're still stretching until eventually the distance rips you apart. And there's no amount of strength that can keep that from happening as we are traveling on our 2 paths. You see where I'm getting at with this? If we find ourselves heading down a different path than God, whether it's because we're being deliberately rebellious or because we're simply distracted. If we find ourselves leading a different path than God's perfect and holy path, we are not going to have that connection that we want to have. It's inevitable. It's how it works. It takes reading the Word. It takes daily engagement with God and His Spirit to be able to stay faithful to that path so that we can keep His hand in ours, so that we can keep our footsteps in His footsteps and more. That is what it takes to have a closeness with God. You want to keep your fire going? You want to keep yourself strong and excited about faith? Be with God. Be with God, day in and day out. If you're here this morning and you would like the prayers of your church as you continue to fight that battle from Satan towards maintaining that perfect path, or if you'd like to start that journey with Jesus today, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.